friends and newcomers to the South Orange Library Lecture Series. Thank you all for coming today. We have a new and special guest speaker, Sean Harvey. He's an author and he's a professor of history at Seton University. In fact, some of his students are here, so he brings his own crowd. That's what we like. And in any case, I was recommended to him by one of our wonderful speakers that we get from Seton University. And it could have been Jim Kimball, it could have been Karen Gavers. We have had wonderful speakers, and the wonderful thing is about it, I don't pay anyone. They all donate their time. And not only do they donate their time, they donate their friends' time. So, here we're now. We have to have this, it's like a recycling thing. You know? And I do appreciate your coming. And when I first got in touch with him, we were talking, and it's the Thursday before Thanksgiving. And what could be more apropos than to talk about Pilgrims, Indians, and the true story of the first Thanksgiving? And I think we need it. And we have, thank God, we have a lot to be thankful for. And being in this community, and with wonderful people like Sandy and the friends, and all the people that work so hard, Nan Salmons and Janet, and everybody here really works together to make other people's lives happier too. So I do appreciate your coming out today, and I can't wait to hear all about Thanksgiving. And you know, what we learned in school was a long time ago for most of us. I hate to say it, a very long time ago. But in any case, before I begin, I always thank all of my fellow friends and librarians for all of their help and support for these programs. I couldn't do it without their help, and I do appreciate it. And now, please, let's give a very warm welcome to our very special guest, Sean Harvey.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you, everyone, for coming out. In early December 1620, a small scouting expedition for a larger group of about 100 Englishmen, Englishwomen, children, most of whom had separated themselves from the Church of England, and about half of whom had come most immediately from Leiden, a city in the Netherlands. They arrived at Patuxet. Patuxet was a village on the coast of what we now call Plymouth Bay. They found an empty village, already cleared fields, and fresh graves. Just recently, this place had been filled with people. Oh, sure.
You can hold this.
The angle at the top.
Oh, there we go. Is that a little bit better? Ah, okay. Now, just recently, this place had been filled with people. Indeed, about 6 years earlier, another Englishman by the name of Thomas Hunt had kidnapped about 20 people from this very place. But it had been ravaged by an epidemic, probably about 1616. It left only about 1,000 people in the immediate vicinity of Cape Cod, from a pre-epidemic population of about 15,000. So we're talking about devastation. As a deeply religious people who had faith in God's absolute power, the Pilgrims called this epidemiological catastrophe providence, God's will. To Pilgrims, North America represented a wilderness, wild and savage. It was always a physical danger. But it also represented a visible, tangible sign of God's power and protection. It was analogous to God guiding the Israelites through the desert as they escaped Egypt. Now, in the next few months, Pilgrims built a few permanent structures. But about a fifth of the group died. They saw no Indians firsthand before mid-February. And it was another month before they communicated with one. In mid-March, an Abenaki sachem, or chief, from what is today Maine, arrived at the settlement. He was carrying a bow and 2 arrows, only one of which was tipped with a point. Probably this was meant to suggest that he brought with him 2 possibilities, war or peace. Now, with a shaved forehead, but long flowing hair, wearing only a loincloth, he would have looked strange to the Pilgrims. And that physical strangeness certainly made the fact that he walked into their town speaking English all the more jarring. He said his name was Samoset, probably a version of the English name Somerset. He asked for a beer. They had none. They gave him some brandy. And he described the land, the people, and the hostility of some who had had friends and relatives stolen from them. Now, the next day he left. He promised to return soon with some of the Pilgrims' nearest neighbors, Pokanokets from the village of Massasoit. And he said he'd bring some beaver furs to trade. Now, we most often think of the Pilgrims as the beginning of English colonization of America. Maybe even as the beginning of something like American freedom. That story is a little bit misleading in a few respects. It fails to account for the fact that Jamestown in Virginia was established as a permanent English settlement more than a decade earlier. It neglects the decades of English and other European fishing and trading activities in what would become New England that preceded Plymouth by decades. Coastal New England had already been transformed by English imperialism long before the Pilgrims arrived. It also obscures what was an international story, linking England and the Netherlands, linking native communities stretching the length of New England that were just as politically distinct as those European countries, and linking each to one another. The godly society that the Pilgrims sought to create, and the one they ended up building, in a lot of ways it looks strange from the perspective of the 21st century United States. But its survival and prosperity ultimately depended on the Pilgrims' ability to forge an alliance with their native neighbors, the Wampanoags. Now, for the rest of my time today, I'll be explaining the Pilgrims, their background, their goals, their early experiences in North America. I'll be explaining the Wampanoags, their experience with European colonization, their stance toward the Pilgrims, and of course that subsequent alliance, which is, along with the Pilgrims' first harvest, what we celebrate on Thanksgiving. Something you might be interested to know, by the way, has only been celebrated regularly since about the Civil War, and something that has only been associated with the Pilgrims in particular since about 1900. Now, the Pilgrims were a kind of Puritan, radical Protestants who thought that the Protestant Reformation in England had not gone far enough, and that living a Christian life required separating themselves from the Church of England entirely. So, that means some Puritans were separatists, but most Puritans thought the separatists were too radical. Now, the Protestant Reformation had been messy in England. After Henry VIII broke with Rome, each of his children wanted to pursue a different path. There was the Puritan King Edward, there was the reign of the Catholic Queen Mary. The ascension of Queen Elizabeth in 1558 brought a settlement, at least for a time, in the form of a moderate Protestantism. Elizabeth, more than anything else, sought uniformity in her church. She authorized the Book of Common Prayer and a book of homilies. Each of these things was designed to limit the expression of an individual minister's theological opinions. Uniformity, though, didn't really exist, in no small part because in much of England, local landowners owned the right to nominate ministers in their neighborhood, in their parishes. And they only nominated those whose opinions they approved of. Support for greater Reformation, in other words, support for Puritan views, was concentrated mainly in London, in the seaports and market towns of southern and eastern England, and in the college towns of Oxford and Cambridge. The distinguishing feature of these Puritans was not so much theological as it was how they behaved After all, the Church of England was Calvinist. Puritans were Calvinists, so was their church, the national church. And this included the idea, complex, very complex, of predestination. Human actions could not earn salvation. This is the fundamental point. That would implicitly deny God's absolute power or sovereignty. Puritans hoped, though, that through moral living and biblical study and prayer, they would prepare themselves for the possibility of salvation. They also believed that saints, the elect, the saved, people who had experienced grace, they would live in visibly godly ways and would prosper. Now, Puritans believed all these things with intensity. They changed their behavior and they demanded that others change their behavior too. Their approach to civic life, social life, economic life, they sought to live as Christian gentlemen. They sought to create a Christian commonwealth. They also called for changes to the Church of England, particularly in liturgy and in the church hierarchy. They wanted prayer that was spontaneous, heartfelt, not stale and recited. They wanted churches to be voluntary. They wanted members to be able to elect their ministers. They wanted to eliminate bishops altogether. Now, the most radical strain of this loose Puritan movement was separatism, which emerged in the 1580s. As a movement, it was most often associated with a man named Robert Brown, who preached the ideas that churches must be voluntary gatherings of the elect. If the elect formed a binding agreement, what they called a covenant, with one another and with God, and then established a godly society, they would flourish as a community. Now, supporters of the existing Church of England thought that this would lead to religious schism. Subjects would form countless churches. That would lead to economic disorder, even anarchy. The Church of England, after all, rested on a system of tithes and rents. The church, in turn, was the basic institution of social welfare. So, a fragmenting church would have economic repercussions. The bishops, we also have to note, were part of the political order in England. And moreover, if separatists denied the crown's leadership of the church, what was to stop them from denying the crown as the legitimate ruler of the kingdom? Indeed, separatists, and even Puritans more broadly, read a variety of radical Protestant writers that articulated exactly this kind of view, and more particularly, a justification for revolution, on the grounds that, kind of drawing on Old Testament stories, that deposing a king was justified if he broke the covenant. Now, we have to note that these religious ideas and practices, they emerged in a notable social context. A pervasive fear around the turn of the 17th century that English society was falling apart. England faced a growing population, the landless being forced from previously common land in a process we call enclosure, and a series of poor harvests. And they experienced all these things as Europe slipped into a deep depression. Between 1500 and 1620, so like the long 16th century, wages for laborers declined by about half in real terms. For rural tenants, rents increased by about a third in just a short period of 10 years after 1594. So we see destitution, desperation, and these gave rise to other social problems. Theft, alcohol abuse, pre- and extramarital sex, broader social tensions. These things, poverty, crime, individuals identified as wandering vagrants, in other words, the landless seeking slim opportunities in towns, and especially in London. These alarmed people who held property. who really feared some kind of peasant uprising or urban revolt. As one English Puritan put it, quote, "Cruelty and blood is in our streets. The land aboundeth with murders, slaughters, incests, adulteries, whoredom, drunkenness, oppression, and pride. Enough to make haste out of Babylon." Now, all the while, the godly feared the consequences of England's incomplete Reformation. And they feared an oncoming war by Catholic powers against Protestant states in Europe. Now, the core of Pilgrims came from a region about 200 miles north of London. You can see it pictured there. This is roughly the area where Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, and Yorkshire meet. Those most attracted to separatism, so in other words, the most radical brand of Puritanism, they're merchants, skilled tradesmen, the landowning gentry, and prospering tenants who had firm holds on long-term leases. What we can note is that it's these groups that had experienced success in the preceding century and more of economic transformation in England. They seem to have found a few things in this brand of radical Protestantism. They found a vision of order, providence, amid change. They found encouragement for individual values of sobriety, diligence, thrift, and restraint. Things that, of course, aid in material success. And they found some concrete solutions for, in their opinion, bettering society. Strict enforcement of laws against drinking and extramarital sex, for instance. Establishing institutions to train workers in a trade and to impose discipline. But these same people, these people who had heretofore experienced success, were also quite conscious of the precariousness of their position, just how delicate their prosperity and status was. And they were worried about the surrounding disorder, as we've suggested. All that gave a particular depth to the fact that right around the turn of the 17th century, Puritans saw increasing signs of political danger. With the emergence of separatism as a movement, Elizabeth became more concerned with suppressing Puritanism more broadly. In the 1580s, she began installing bishops who would enforce conformity. And in 1593, she prohibited private religious meetings, or as they were called, conventicles. King James ascended the throne in 1603. To him, Puritans were, quote, pests in the church and commonweal. He issued new proclamations against nonconformity, demanded that ministers subscribe to, in other words, sign their names affirming, full support for the Book of Common Prayer. And he required church wardens in each parish to report any word of these private conventicles. In the next decade, about 80 Puritan ministers were forced out of their parishes across England. Now that only represents about 1% of the English ministry, but several were in the immediate neighborhood of those who became separatists. And after these events, small groups began establishing their own congregations. Now, in the words of William Bradford, and let me say, these pictures come from a 19th century text, so these are not, definitely not from life, although that is an admirable mustache. In the words of William Bradford, who is one of our two most important chroniclers of the Pilgrims, quote, "The Lord's free people joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord." Now, the self-created congregation that most pilgrims belonged to was at a large manor house in Scrooby. But according to Bradford, it drew from, quote, "sundry towns and villages, in the surrounding counties. Now, Scrooby was the home of William Brewster, who was a Cambridge-educated local official. But it was the property of the Archbishop of York, and it had once been a Benedictine abbey before Henry VIII had dissolved the monasteries. Now, not long after the formation of these separate churches, a royal court, the Court of High Commission, targeted William Brewster and another Scrooby man for nonconformity. Now, it's worth noting that the court was doing the same thing to Catholics who refused to conform to the Church of England. But separatists feared that they might eventually be charged with sedition, right? Opposition to the state church is opposition to the state. And that, of course, was a capital crime. So those separatists decided to flee. After a failed attempt in 1607, they succeeded the following year under the leadership of a man named Thomas Elvish. Now, that second attempt succeeded mainly because King James pretty much let them go. They were troublemakers, and he kind of wanted to banish them anyway. Banishment was actually the crime or was the punishment for separatism. And he wanted to make sure that his political opponents did not use the Pilgrims as a platform for a legal challenge to various kind of court jurisdictions at the time. These Pilgrims made their way to the Dutch Republic, or the Netherlands, a place where significant numbers of separatists had already migrated to. Now, the Netherlands was predominantly Calvinist, and there the Pilgrims possessed limited religious liberty. More specifically, they were not forced to join the Dutch Reformed Church. They settled in Leiden, which was a large city, in Bradford's words, of a fair and beautiful city, of a sweet situation. Now, Leiden specialized in the manufacturing of textiles, particularly brilliantly dyed light woolen fabrics called Sez. Now, amid this economic boom that these textiles provided, Leiden grew rapidly. A population of about 10,000 in the 1570s grew to more than 45,000 half a century later, by 1622. Naturally, these English separatists found varied work in this woolens industry. They were shearers, they were weavers, spinners, dyers, fullers, people who beat the fabric. But according to Bradford, quote, "It was not long before they saw the grim and grisly face of poverty coming on them like an armed man." We have to appreciate, they were refugees, and they occupied the bottom of the social ladder in the city. They lived in its filthiest parts, many in a public housing project that was actually built atop old Catholic cloisters. They were able to afford only a harsh diet, and they worked long hours, doing hard, tedious labor that exposed their lungs to harmful dust. They worried about their children growing up in such an atmosphere. They might turn to crime. Maybe they would just flee Leiden on an East Indies-bound ship. Even if they remained, our other most important chronicler of the Pilgrims, Edward Winslow, expressed the fear that they simply would not grow up English in a Dutch city. Pilgrims also faced the danger of living in a city divided by intertwined social and religious conflicts. These led to riots that rocked Leiden and other Dutch cities in the late 16 teens. It's these riots that provide the ultimate catalyst for Pilgrims considering colonizing North America. So, about a decade after their migration to Leiden, that's really all they were there, they wanted more opportunity, and they wanted to maintain their religious liberty. They also recognized that the English Virginia Company needed settlers. So they thought about colonizing North America. It's worth noting that a year earlier, in 1616, John Smith, a Virginia colonial leader and a booster of increased English colonization of North America, he returned from a voyage to this place he called New England. He touted its economic opportunities: furs, fishing, timber, and he was oddly quiet on the severity of New England winters. At the same time, though, Pilgrims considered an offer from the Dutch West India Company. Now, this was a merchant group that had, in the Netherlands, exclusive rights to colonize and trade in New Netherland. So this is basically what today we'd call the Hudson Valley and eventually the Delaware Valley as well. Now, the Dutch West India Company hoped that English migrants would settle the region around the mouth of the Hudson. In other words, New York. Dutch leaders, though, ultimately rejected this plan. And they rejected this plan because they feared it would somehow alienate the English king. And the Netherlands was counting on the support of England in an anticipated resumption of war with Spain. So, the New Netherland project never really came to fruition. But Pilgrims decided to actually stick with the target, the mouth of the Hudson. But now they started calling it the northern parts of Virginia. King James acceded to the plan. After all, it cost the crown nothing. This was a privately funded venture. And the colony had potential for producing naval stores that would strengthen the English Navy, and just as importantly, free it from an over-reliance on Russian sources for naval stores. So, the Pilgrims obtained royal permission to settle in North America in 1617, but it took time to find the necessary investors and to plan the voyage and the settlement. Now, these investors were initially drawn to the project mainly because it offered a way to obtain a particularly high-value commodity, and we can see it on the official seal of the colony of New Netherland: beaver. Now, soft, warm beaver hats had been prominent in the Middle Ages, but they declined in the 1400s, mainly because beavers in Europe were hunted almost to extinction. With a new supply from northern North America, though, they became fashionable once again by the 1570s. By the 1620s, they were ubiquitous among the prospects. So, seeing an opportunity for obtaining beaver without needing any gold or silver to pay for it, about 70 gentlemen, merchants, and tradesmen financed the Pilgrims' voyage through an adventure. In other words, venture capital. For this group, the colony was not religious, but rather commercial. So this joint stock company that the adventurers or investors established owned the land in Plymouth. They owned any buildings that the Pilgrims built, and they owned any profits that were made from the trade. At the end of a 7-year period, investors and colonists would appraise the colony's assets and distribute dividends according to numbers of shares held. Now, of the investors, no more than a small handful were separatists, although many were moderate Puritans. Just as significantly, none had any experience with the North American trade. Now, we don't know exactly how much money they sunk into the colony, although John Smith estimated around 7,000 pounds sterling. That would be a market value of about 1,500 acres of prime English farmland. So, substantial outlet. From the perspective of these investors, the early history of the colony was a disaster. Initially, the voyage to New England was to include 2 vessels, the Mayflower, and the Speedwell. They departed Southampton in early August 1620, but soon turned back because the Speedwell was leaking. After repairs, they both departed again in late August. They turned back again for the same reason. The Speedwell was declared unseaworthy. The Mayflower alone departed from Old Plymouth in early September, about a month later than was originally planned for. Now, the Mayflower was about 100 feet long and about 25 feet across at its widest point. It was built for hauling cargo, mainly cloth and wine. On this voyage, it carried 102 people. Just under half of these were adult men, in addition to a crew of about 24 or so. Now, from deck to deck, the headroom was about 5 feet. But of course, any place there was a crossbeam, less. It was dim during the day, totally dark at night. It was cluttered with various maritime material, and it smelled of vinegar, various bodily fluids, and rotten food. Surprisingly, there was only one death on the voyage. It was the wife of William Bradford, who drowned. We don't know if she fell overboard or if she committed suicide. There was also a birth, a boy that the Hopkins family named Oceanus. The Mayflower was blown off course by a storm, and it never made it to the mouth of the Hudson. It anchored at Provincetown Harbor on Cape Cod on November 11th. It represented a safe end to an Atlantic passage. As Bradford wrote, quote, "They fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven who had brought them across the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all their perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth." It also represented a legal problem, because the Pilgrims were outside of the bounds of the land demarcated in their patent. Now, according to Edward Winslow, quote, "It was thought good, therefore, that there should be an association and agreement, that we should combine together in one body, and to submit to such government and governors as we should by common consent agree to make and choose." The result was the Mayflower Compact, probably drafted by William Brewster and signed by 41 men, all but one of the freemen aboard the Mayflower and a few servants. They, quote, "solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic." They would enact, quote, "just and equal laws for the general good of the colony." These were not radical phrases. They were not even Puritan phrases. This kind of language was ubiquitous in English royal charters for boroughs in England. And the Pilgrims in that document acknowledged that their sovereign remained King James. Interesting to note that during the English Civil War, they actually crossed that part out. Eventually, in 1630, the colony received a new patent. It secured the colony's claim to land in the eyes of England. But a patent did not confer rights to self-government. That required a charter. Plymouth never got a charter. So, for the Pilgrims, this compact remained fundamental. Now, for most of the colony's first 2 decades, the colony functioned as a direct democracy of freeholders. And it's worth noting that that status in Plymouth was not limited to church members, as it was, or I should say, as it would be in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, I'd be happy to say more about government and church in Plymouth in the question and answer if you guys would like to know more. Now, after a few scouting expeditions, they found Plymouth Bay on December 10th. And there they began preparations to settle. It was a good site, not a great site, but it was a good site. It provided fresh running water, harbor, flat land for cultivation, nearby hunting possibilities, a hill that would allow for some defense. They hoped, although they did not yet know, that it would provide longer-term trading opportunities with natives. That trade, they knew, was how they would obtain furs to ship to England to pay off their debts. The decision to settle at Plymouth was made with a great deal of urgency, because by early December, supplies were dwindling, the ground was already covered in about 6 inches of snow, and settlers were beginning to die. 3 already since the landing. So let's talk more about this North American context that Pilgrims landed amid. Now, on their early expeditions, as they scouted for a place to settle, the Pilgrims plundered several of the graves that they found. It was how they obtained their first seed corn for planting. They also found knives and white bead jewelry. Now, perhaps in retaliation for these desecrations, perhaps because the locals associated the newcomers with the kidnappers that we've already mentioned, or with the killers of a recent trading party, a party of about 30 to 40 natives attacked the scouting party with a storm of arrows. Now the Pilgrims, the scouting expedition, under the command of Miles Standish, who was a veteran of the Dutch war against Spain, repelled them with muskets. After that skirmish, for the colony's first few months, as dozens of settlers died, the indigenous inhabitants of the region kept their distance, until Samoset strolled into Plymouth in mid-March. He returned a few days later, just like he said he would, and he brought with him a man from Patuxet, the village that the Pilgrims renamed Plymouth. Now this man, Tisquantum, or as it's usually said, Squanto, also spoke English. He had been among the 20 inhabitants of Patuxet that Thomas Hunt had taken. He had already spent about a decade in England as a slave. In captivity, he accompanied voyages financed by Sir Fernando Gorges, an important English booster of New England colonization. One historian has noted that Tisquantum probably spent more time in London than all but 2 of the Pilgrims. It's pretty remarkable to think about. Now, Tisquantum acted as a crucial intermediary between Plymouth and the local sachem, Massasoit. He was fluent in the languages of each. He could describe northeastern North America and its peoples to the Pilgrims, and he could describe Pilgrims and the English to Massasoit and his people. About a week after Samoset first introduced himself, Massasoit and about 60 warriors made themselves visible on a nearby hill. Winslow and a contingent from Plymouth went out to meet Massasoit and his men. With Tisquantum as an interpreter, Winslow spoke of friendship and invited the sachem to come to Plymouth to meet with the colony's governor, John Carver. Now, with Winslow left behind as a hostage, Standish led Massasoit into Plymouth. Carver kissed Massasoit's hand, and Massasoit reciprocated. They agreed to an alliance. Massasoit acknowledged the existence of Plymouth as an English place, and Plymouth offered aid against Massasoit's enemies. Now, to fully appreciate why Massasoit chose to ally with the newcomers, we must consider Eastern North America at the turn of the 17th century more fully. Already by the mid-1500s, various Indian groups welcomed trade with Europeans. Items obtained from Europeans went into circulation through long-established native trade routes. The most fundamental innovation were metal cutting edges, not firearms at first, although these became increasingly important over the course of the 1600s. These new goods that Europeans brought were almost always better in some way. They were lighter, they were sharper, they were more durable. But they were used in familiar contexts. This trade that developed became so central to early native European relations that many native people simply referred to the newcomers with labels that identified them with the things that they brought. So in other words, the English were knife men, or they were axe makers. Now, when Europeans began to arrive not simply for a short period of trade, but rather to establish more permanent settlements, the local Indians weighed benefits. Now, in some cases, native leaders who already enjoyed regional dominance sought to further consolidate their power by controlling access to this European trade. This is effectively what happens in the Chesapeake. There, Powhatan, recognized by the English as a king or as an emperor, forged an alliance with Jamestown through the marriage of his young daughter Pocahontas to a colonial leader. Elsewhere in North America, though, the situation was different. Leaders of peoples who were devastated by disease, who feared survival, they sought alliance with Europeans as a new source of strength against enemies. This was the decision that Massasoit made. His people had been decimated by disease, and their traditional rivals to the west, the Narragansetts, had not been. He sought an alliance of equals with his new neighbors, one that offered new paths toward prosperity and security. And indeed, this alliance strengthened his people's regional position considerably. Massasoit made other native people in the region deal with him if they wanted access to what the English had. And he exacted tribute from them for it. Now, in the initial months of the alliance, it was clear that other local sachems were skeptical of, if not hostile, toward this alliance. But by early September, doubtless owing to the work of Massasoit, several other local sachems made peace with Plymouth, and, at least according to the Pilgrims, swore allegiance to King James. As part of this alliance, Tisquantum taught the Pilgrims how to cultivate land in the Indian fashion, creating small mounds for corn, beans, and squash. Interestingly, he apparently also urged them to manure the fields with fish, something that was not a traditional practice. We should appreciate the degree to which settlers' lives, and really all farmers' lives in the early modern Atlantic world, were bound by the cycle of seasons, its natural rhythms. In the spring and the summer, individual and communal efforts bent toward planting and cultivating, and other outdoor work necessary for survival and comfort. Winter eventually would bring a physical contraction of life. Shorter days, less work, less socializing. Between them lay autumn. It was a period both of hope and of anxiety. Several weeks of intense work of harvest would culminate the whole previous year's work. It would determine whether the coming winter would be a period of plenty or of hunger. For Pilgrims, that first harvest was bountiful. In good Calvinist fashion, they called for a day of communal thanksgiving. Now, according to Winslow, who gives the fuller of the only two accounts that we have, the colony's governor, Carver, planned the feast to celebrate the first harvest. He sent 4 men fowling, and they killed a week's worth of birds in a single day. They invited Massasoit, who brought with him 90 men. They added 5 deer. Pilgrims and Wampanoag celebrated for 3 days, feasting and shooting. Don't forget, Massasoit and his people may have felt reasons for celebration too. Plymouth began to grow, modestly, and with no real commercial profits for the colony's investors. But the colony and its alliance still faced dangers. In the winter of 1621-22, Narragansetts sent Plymouth a bundle of arrows wrapped in a rattlesnake skin. Pilgrims somewhat confused, but thinking they knew what it meant, turned to Tisquantum for meaning. What Tisquantum said both confirmed their fears but also surprised them. Tisquantum told them that it meant war, and that Massasoit intended to attack them. Now, Tisquantum was apparently trying to make himself even more important as a necessary diplomatic mediator, not just a translator, but a diplomatic mediator between Massasoit and Plymouth. But what he said was apparently untrue. When Massasoit found out, he demanded that the Pilgrims hand Tisquantum over. The Pilgrims refused, but Tisquantum died of disease shortly thereafter. We have to appreciate that these were tense times, because early in 1622, the Pilgrims learned that Virginia Indians had risen up and massacred about a third of the settlement at Jamestown. Now, amid conflict among the original Pilgrims and actually new arrivals from England, and amid a fear that Massasoit was dying for a time, the Pilgrims discovered that they did, in fact, face an alliance of most of the Indians against them, from the Cape to the Bay, under the leadership of a Massachusetts sachem named Wittawammet. Now, Miles Standish, that military figure, led a small party on an expedition that posed as a trading venture. It amounted to a preemptive attack in the form of an assassination. They killed Wittawammet and killed several of his men. Shortly after that, the Plymouth colony began making some significant changes to its social organization. Ultimately, these seemed to aid the colony's prosperity. So in 1623, for example, Plymouth abandoned what had initially been communal agricultural practices, and instead demarcated particular plots of land that became the responsibility of individual households. Within a few years, colonists had relatively few luxury goods, but they ate well and they held their land in freehold, something that was increasingly unlikely in England. In 1625, Winslow led the first Pilgrim trading expedition to the Kennebec River in Maine. This had been the focus of numerous early 17th century efforts on the part of England and France. It was a mission to trade with the Abenakis, some of Samoset's people. They returned with furs weighing about 700 pounds, or about the pelts of about 400 animals. The Abenakis lived on a land that was crisscrossed with rivers and creeks that were teeming with beaver. Winslow and the Pilgrim expedition took corn to trade with these people. Their land, after all, lay on the kind of the northernmost periphery of where cultivation of corn was possible. But the most important item they took to trade was wampum. Now, for centuries, the shells of whelk and quahog clams, which are found especially along Long Island Sound, were highly prized in Native America, probably because of the extraordinary ways in which they reflect light. You only get a small hint of it on this image, unfortunately. Now, because of their significance as prestige items, both as gifts and as tribute, colonists mistook its use among Native people as local money, and so they started using it as local money that they exchanged for furs. Here, the English followed the lead, once again, of the Dutch. What we see is an overall intensification of wampum production by Native people along Long Island Sound. For the Pilgrims, it was an auspicious time to open the fur trade in North America. The price of beaver pelts was just at that moment beginning to soar. Prices jumped from about 5 shillings per pelt to about 20 shillings per pelt between 1621 and 1628. So exactly at the moment that the Pilgrims established their connection in Maine. Prices were rising because England and France appeared to be nearing war, and the felt producers feared a disruption of production. Now, I said it was an auspicious time to open that trade, But for the Pilgrims, it was also a necessary time, because the colony was bankrupt. In the winter of 1626-27, Plymouth's leaders negotiated new deals with other colonists and with the remaining investors in the Plymouth enterprise. Of the original group of 70 investors, only 6 remained. Basically what was hammered out was a deal that required about 9 yearly payments to the investors, and in exchange the investors would basically write off every other debt that the Pilgrims owed, and they would also withdraw any claim to the land or the improvements on the land that the Pilgrims made in North America. That was part of the agreement. But the other part of the agreement was the agreement that the Pilgrim leaders made with other Plymouth settlers. Basically, a small group in the colony assumed personal liability for making those payments in exchange for an exclusive claim to the profits on the fur trade until 1633. So we see 2 sets of negotiations here between the colonial leaders of Plymouth. One with their investors in London, the other with other settlers in Plymouth. In 1628, the Pilgrims established a fortified trading post in Maine at a place called Cushnock on the Kennebec River. Overall, the alliance dramatically transformed the region. The large quantities of beaver pelts that the Pilgrims began sending back to England by 1628 showed investors there that a colony in the region could be profitable. It's that fact, plus a continuing deterioration of conditions in England for Puritans, that inspired the much, much, much larger Bay Colony, beginning in 1629. Now, the development of the fur trade and the establishment of Massachusetts Bay fueled the growth of Plymouth, as each courted increased agricultural production. As Bradford noted, though, worryingly, colonists, quote, began to grow in their outward estates. As they did so, they dispersed. They sought more land for cultivation and ever more ground for grazing cattle. Bradford and others feared that this would, quote, provoke the Lord's displeasure against them, as the colony turned away from the covenant in pursuit of worldly gain. By the end of the 1640s, the colony consisted of about 10 towns stretched across 40 miles. This was something a little bit different from the Puritan goal of creating a closely knit village organized around church. It also jeopardized the kind of alliance that Massasoit thought he had forged. Now, for Massasoit's people, the Pokanokets, this period, roughly the 1620s to the 1650s, represented a time of economic prosperity and political influence. And it did so because of the successful way that Wampanoags had managed their relations with the English colonists. Something that allowed them an elevated position over other native people in the region. But by the 1660s, that power was declining. Trade with the English increasingly exposed the Pokanokets to European diseases. Over 2 to 3 generations, this is a general statement about North America, over 2 to 3 generations, European diseases tended to kill about 75% to 90% of native communities. Over 2 to 3 generations. Now, the survivors of stricken communities either coalesced with other remnants, or they were absorbed into larger peoples. The people that we call Wampanoags probably emerged in exactly this way, as the growing wealth and prestige of Massasoit's people, the Pokanokets, made them a magnet for local, culturally similar indigenous people. But as an intercolonial trade increased, so as Plymouth's trade with New Netherland, illegal, or with Massachusetts Bay increased, and especially as New England colonies began trading with the increasingly plantation slavery-oriented colonies of the West Indies, As that intercolonial trade increased, the colony's trade with native people decreased in importance, and wampum decreased in value. This was especially damaging precisely because the demographic losses that the Indians suffered with the accompanying loss of traditional knowledge meant that native communities were ever more economically dependent on European goods by the mid to late 17th century. As this was happening, the Wampanoags faced greater and greater population pressures from Plymouth and from the proliferating number of English colonies in the region, Massachusetts Bay, the new colony of Rhode Island. This meant not simply the loss of territory, but also a very real danger posed by English livestock. Cattle, and especially the pigs that the English left to roam and graze, devoured unenclosed native fields. And it pushed deer and other game out of the ecological niche that they had long enjoyed. In addition, colonists insisted on extending English laws over the land occupied by Indians, even as they excluded Wampanoags from formal membership in the colony. Finally, the Wampanoags faced cultural pressures, especially amid a brief surge in missionary activity in New England, roughly the 1650s to the early 1670s. This led significant numbers of Wampanoags to adapt Christianity, living in separate praying towns away from their pagan countrymen and outside of the authority of a Wampanoag sachem. Now, these varied pressures, the suspicion that Englishmen had actually poisoned Massasoit's successor, led Massasoit's son or grandson, our sources are in conflict here, to organize an alliance of the region's Indians against the English colonies, thus producing the devastating conflict known as King Philip's War. This was in 1675, 1676. About half the white population of the colonies was killed in this conflict, and about half of all New England towns were at least temporarily depopulated, pushing back the line of settlement. On the other side, though, about 5,000 Indians were killed in battle or died from the hunger and disease that accompanied the war. This represented about 40% of the surviving New England native population. And the English sold 1,000 more of the region's indigenous people into slavery in the Caribbean. Now, New Englanders understood this conflict through the intertwined, mixing my metaphors here, we'll just say through the lenses of religion, right? Trials of faith, providence in their deliverance, but also an ascendant set of notions that suggested that Indians were all basically the same, some essentially different from colonists, regardless of whether those Indians were Christian or not. These are ideas that look a lot like race. Now, among the effects of this war was that Plymouth was eventually absorbed into the larger Massachusetts Bay colony in 1691. And also that the surviving and remaining New England Algonquians were marginalized in New England society, though they remain in the region still today. So I'll stop there. Thanks. Be happy to take questions if you have them.
Were most of the immigrants from England in the mid-1600s still these very radical Calvinists, or were other religious splinter groups involved too?
In the mid-1600s?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So most are Calvinist. The way most historians have written about kind of Puritanism as a movement is stressing just how diverse it was. And so, kind of like, I'm thinking of actually one book that's on there, The Long Argument, makes this argument that we have to understand kind of competing strains. There's a strain of this radical Protestantism that's basically trying to create as big of a church as possible and one that has as broad an effect on society as possible. This is a kind of a magisterial version of radical Protestantism. On the other hand, you get the sectarian strain of Puritanism, which doesn't want to make a broad church, it wants to make a pure church. And that kind of devotion to purity leads to fragmentation. You know, kind of most famously, there's this figure, Roger Williams, right, pivotal in the founding of Rhode Island. I mean, he's effectively a church of one. He won't even take communion with his wife. But I mean, he's an extreme example, but also emblematic of this. There's a real discomfort for some of these radical Protestants at forming a church with someone that they don't consider to be themselves one of the elect. And so what you see is a real fragmentation. Now, by the 18th century, there are kind of various theological movements that are trying to soften the edges of Calvinism. And actually, that's true even in the early 17th century. Those riots that we talked about in Leiden and the other Dutch cities are in part about a group of powerful people in the Netherlands who are attracted to the theology of this theologian by the name of Arminius, who wants to basically to cast away that idea of predestination and stress individual people's possibility of working for salvation, of earning salvation. So it's overall, overwhelmingly, yes, they are Calvinist. Yes, they think that the Church of England's Reformation had not gone far enough. But that's about the only similarity that you can draw. There's a lot of differences among that group. Thanks. Good question.
I'd like to ask you, when we were in school, we learned a little bit less about all of this, a lot less. And it was, these people didn't have freedom, they came to America, and the Indians shook hands. It didn't say about the trading, and so are the books being revised to show a little bit more truth?
Yeah, no question. So, and it very much varies by the book. So, there are lots of specialized studies that go into particular details about Puritan theology, or about the kind of like the social worlds in which they lived in Scrooby or in Leiden. And there's a lot of archaeologists and historians working on trying to recapture North America as it existed immediately before colonization and in the earliest days of colonization. Right, because kind of the long tendency was you just kind of, right, there's Columbus in 1492, and then there's Plymouth in 1620. Okay, well, that leaves about 120 years in which there is sporadic but continuous European contact on the eastern North American, or I should say the Atlantic coast of North America. So there's a lot of work going on into recovering that. It is very uneven how much all of those specialized studies are kind of trickling down into popular books or textbooks that students read in school.
Well, you were wonderful.